The air in the operating theater at Northwestern Memorial was Dr. Elias Vance's natural habitat. It was a sterile, cold, and unforgiving environment where the only god was precision. Tonight, the god was being tested. The patient on the table, a John Doe brought in by paramedics, was less a man and more a catastrophic puzzle. A single 9mm bullet had entered his left temporal lobe, carving a path of destruction through delicate neural pathways that held memories, personality, and the very essence of self. BP is dropping, doctor. Tachycardia at 140, a nurse announced, her voice a calm ripple in the tense ocean of the room. Elias didn't look up from the brain scan displayed on the monitor. The image was a nightmare of shattered bone fragments and blossoming hemorrhage. The bullet was lodged precariously close to the brainstem. The ER attending had called it a non-survivable injury, he'd said, his face grim. We should call the organ procurement team. But Elias had seen something else. A flicker. A ghost of a chance in the devastating landscape of the scan. It was the kind of challenge that ignited the cold fire in his soul, the very reason he'd dedicated 2 decades of his life to neurosurgery. He was known for pulling miracles out of thin air, for walking into rooms where hope had died and coaxing it back to life. No, Elias had said, his voice quiet but absolute. Prep or 3. We're going in. Now, 3 hours into the craniotomy, sweat beaded on his brow beneath his surgical cap. His hands, instruments of impossible delicacy, moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He was an artist, and his medium was living tissue. He irrigated the wound, suctioning away blood and debris, his loops magnifying the brutal geography of the injury. There it is, he murmured, more to himself than to his team. The deformed slug of lead was nestled against the pawns. 1 millimeter of error, 1 tremor, and the man's autonomic functions, breathing, heartbeat, would cease instantly. The room held its breath. The only sounds were the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and the gentle hum of the machines that sustained the life hanging in the balance. With forceps designed for just such a task, Elias approached the bullet. He could feel the collective will of his team focused on the tips of his fingers. He closed the forceps, the metal kissing metal with a faint click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He withdrew it, slowly, deliberately, a fisherman pulling a leviathan from the deep. He dropped the bullet into a sterile basin with a clatter. It's out. Let's debride and close. Quickly. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a wave of exhausted professionalism. The next 6 hours were a meticulous process of reconstruction, patching the dura mater, piecing together the jigsaw of the skull with titanium plates and screws. As he sutured the final layer of skin, the first hints of a Chicago dawn were painting the sky outside. Elias felt the familiar post-operative cocktail of godlike triumph and profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He had stared into the abyss and wrestled a life from its grasp. The days that followed were a waiting game. The patient, still a John Doe, lay in the narrow ICU, a web of tubes and wires connecting him to the machines that breathed and fed him. Elias found himself drawn to the man's bedside more often than was strictly necessary. He felt a proprietary connection to him, a sculptor visiting his most challenging creation. The man had no identification, no one to claim him. His face, once swollen and bruised, had settled into stark, handsome features. High cheekbones, a strong jaw hidden beneath a dark, trimmed beard, and a cascade of black hair. One distinguishing feature, however, had been noted during the initial intake, a tattoo on his right forearm. It was a complex, Celtic knot design, a coiled serpent biting its own tail, but looped through the center was a distinctive, 3-pronged knot Elias had never seen before. Weeks turned into a month. The patient defied all odds. He began breathing on his own. His brain activity, once a chaotic storm, stabilized. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, as Elias was checking his pupillary response, the man's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, piercing blue. They darted around the room, filled with a profound and terrifying confusion. "Where?" he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "You're in a hospital," Elias said gently. "You've been in an accident. Can you tell me your name?" The man's brow furrowed. The panic in his eyes was palpable. I don't know. It was expected. Traumatic brain injury of this magnitude almost always came with amnesia. They continued to call him John Doe, and Elias oversaw his slow, arduous journey back. He learned to speak again, his words hesitant at first, then flowing with a faint, lilting accent he couldn't place. He learned to walk, his gait unsteady but determined. Through it all, a personality emerged, one of quiet gratitude, gentle humor, and a deep, haunting sadness for the life he couldn't remember. Elias found himself liking the man, this blank slate he had saved. The mystery of his identity became a quiet obsession for Elias. He ran the tattoo through every database he could think of, with no luck. He felt a strange need to anchor this man back to the world, to complete the act of saving him. The answer came from the most unexpected of places. It was a Sunday, and Elias was on a video call with his great-aunt Amelia, the family's nonagenarian matriarch and self-appointed historian. She lived in a sprawling, dusty house in Vermont, surrounded by generations of Vance family artifacts. "You look tired, Eli," she said, her voice crackling over the tablet. "Still playing God in that big city hospital?" Elias smiled. "Something like that, Aunt Amelia. I have a patient, a bit of a puzzle. A John Doe. We're trying to identify him. He has this tattoo." He sketched the coiled serpent and the strange central knot on a piece of paper and held it up to the camera. The change in his aunt's demeanor was instantaneous and chilling. The warm, crinkled smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Her eyes, usually clouded with age, became sharp and clear as ice. "Where did you see that?" she demanded, her voice low and tight. "On my patient. It's on his forearm. Do you recognize it?" "Recognize it?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a venom that shocked him. "I'd recognize that cursed mark in the pits of hell. That is the crest of the Donovans." The name meant nothing to Elias. "The Donovans? Who are they?" Aunt Amelia leaned closer to the camera, her face a pale, wrinkled fury. "They are the reason our family fled Ireland in 1848 with nothing but the clothes on our backs. They are the reason your great-great-great-grandfather, Liam Vance, was buried in an unmarked grave. They are poison, Elias. A blood feud that has spanned 2 centuries. They stole our land, murdered our kin, and burned our homes. The Donovans are our sworn enemies. It is a hate that runs deeper than blood, a debt that can never be paid." Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a feeling so alien and primal it was like a vestigial organ stirring to life. He stared at the screen, at the face of his gentle, elderly aunt contorted by an ancient rage. The stories she told him as a child, tales of hardship and betrayal in the old country, suddenly coalesced from vague folklore into a sharp, horrifying reality. "That can't be," he whispered. "This is 2025. People don't have blood feuds anymore. Time does not extinguish a fire like that, Eli," she said, her voice dropping to a solemn whisper. "It only banks the embers. Stay away from that man. Nothing good can come from a Donovan." The call ended, but the silence in Elias's sterile apartment was deafening. He looked at his hands, the hands that had meticulously pieced a man's brain back together. He felt a wave of nausea. He had poured his genius, his very soul, into saving the life of a man whose ancestors had destroyed his own. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. The man in the ICU bed was not just a patient. He was the embodiment of a generational curse, an enemy delivered to him by the cruelest twist of fate. The next day, Elias walked into his patient's room with a heavy heart. The man was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. He turned and smiled when Elias entered. It was a warm, genuine smile that had, until yesterday, filled Elias with a sense of accomplishment. Today, it felt like a deception. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice stronger now. "Good morning." Elias couldn't bring himself to return the smile. He gestured to the man's right arm. "Your tattoo. Can you tell me what it means?" The man looked down at the intricate knotwork as if seeing it for the first time. He traced the lines with his finger. I don't know. It feels familiar, like a song I can't remember the words to. It feels like home." The name Donovan, Elias said, the word feeling like stone in his mouth. "Does that mean anything to you?" The man's blue eyes widened. A flicker of something, recognition, pain, fear, crossed his face. It was a micro-expression, gone in an instant, but Elias, a man trained to notice the smallest neurological tics, saw it clearly. "Donovan," the man repeated slowly. The name seemed to unlock a door deep within his fractured memory. He winced, his hand going to his head. "My name is Finn. Finian Donovan." It was a confirmation, and it hit Elias like a physical blow. The abstract fury of his aunt's story now had a face and a name. Finian Donovan. He saw Liam Vance's unmarked grave. He saw the stolen land, the burning homes. An illogical, inherited rage surged through him. He had held this man's life in his hands. He could have just stopped. He could have let nature take its course, let the bullet finish the job his ancestors had started. The thought was so vile, so contrary to every principle he had ever held, that it terrified him. "I have to go," Elias said abruptly, turning and leaving the room before he said something he would regret. For the next week, he avoided Finn. He assigned his care to another surgeon, citing a heavy caseload. But he couldn't escape. At night, he dreamed of his operating theater, but instead of surgical tools, his hands held ancient swords. He saw Finn on the operating table, his face morphing into the faces of 100 sneering ancestors. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding with a phantom hatred. He was a man of science, of logic and reason. This tribal, centuries-old animosity had no place in his world. Yet, it was there, a dark undercurrent pulling him down. He had defined himself by his ability to save lives, to be objective, to separate the patient from the person. But Finn wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a symbol. Finally, he knew he couldn't run from it. He had to confront it, if only to understand the war raging inside himself. He went to Finn's room late one night. Finn was awake, staring at the ceiling. "I know who you are," Elias said, his voice flat. He didn't mean Finian Donovan. He meant something more. Finn looked at him, his blue eyes filled with a weary sadness. The past few weeks had been a storm of returning memories, fragmented, painful flashes of a life he barely recognized. "My father used to tell me stories," Finn said, his voice barely a whisper. "Old stories. About a feud. About a family called the Vances." He looked at Elias, a dawning, horrified realization on his face. "Vance, like your name." Elias nodded, his jaw tight. "My great-great-great-grandfather was Liam Vance." "Your family." "I know," Finn interrupted, his voice breaking. "They took his land. There was a fight. A death. My family told the story like a victory. A point of pride." He closed his eyes, a tear tracing a path through the stubble on his cheek. "But my father, he was different. He saw it as a stain on our name. A curse we carried. He said the hate was a disease, passed down from father to son, and it was killing us from the inside." Finn pushed himself up, his movements still weak. "That's why I left Ireland. I came to America to escape it. To be just Finn, not a Donovan burdened by the sins of men long dead. I didn't want the hate. I didn't want the stories." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "And look where it got me. A random mugging on a Chicago street, a bullet in my head, and I wake up to be saved by the one man on earth whose ancestors would want me dead." The raw, painful confession stripped away the last of Elias's inherited rage. He didn't see a Donovan anymore. He saw a man, just like him, trying to escape a history he never chose. He saw a man who had been the victim not of a blood feud, but of the random, senseless violence of a modern city. The feud, the stories, the centuries of animosity, it all felt so absurdly small in the quiet, sterile confines of that hospital room. It was a ghost, a phantom limb that the two families had been feeling for generations. Elias pulled a chair up to the bedside and sat down. He looked at his hands, the surgeon's hands. They weren't made for vengeance. They were made for healing. That was his identity. Not a Vance with a grievance, but a doctor with a patient. It was the oath he had taken, not to a family or a clan, but to humanity itself. "The bullet tore through your Wernicke's area," Elias said, his voice shifting back to the familiar, reassuring cadence of a physician. "It's the part of the brain that governs language comprehension. The fact that you're speaking this clearly is remarkable." Finn looked at him, confusion warring with hope in his eyes. You saved me." "Why?" Elias met his gaze. The weight of 200 years of hatred seemed to hang between them, and in that moment, Elias let it fall away. "Because a man was dying on my table," he said simply. "That's all I saw." It was the truest thing he had ever said. In that moment, he hadn't been a Vance. He had been a healer. And by saving Finian Donovan, by choosing his oath over his blood, he had inadvertently saved himself. He had severed the chain, ending a war that had been fought only in memory. The feud didn't die in the green fields of 19th century Ireland. It died here, tonight, under the fluorescent lights of a Chicago hospital, between two men who chose to be more than just their last names. They were a doctor and his patient. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.